On March 15, 1847, a scream echoed through the Virginia countryside unlike anything the residents of Cumberland County had ever heard. It was neither the cry of an animal being slaughtered, nor the wail of a woman in childbirth. Something far more disturbing was the source. According to sealed court documents discovered only decades later, dismembered in their plantation home were 13 members of the Peton family, arranged with a surgical precision that baffled investigators. The local sheriff's report, buried for over a century, described cuts so clean and methodical they appeared to be the work of someone possessing intimate knowledge of anatomy. Even more chilling is what makes this case: the prime suspect, a slave known only as Isaac, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind evidence that would make even seasoned lawmen question everything they thought they knew about the peculiar institution of slavery. Before the story of Isaac and the Peton plantation continues, if these dark chapters of American history, deliberately hidden from textbooks, fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. The most disturbing secrets buried in our nation's past are what we uncover. Also, in the comments, let me know what state you're listening from. I'm curious to see how far these forgotten stories reach. Forever changed by the events that transpired at Peton Grove would be how authorities in antebellum, Virginia, viewed the relationship between master and slave. Though the truth of what happened that March evening would remain locked away in courthouse vaults until long after the Civil War had ended, Cumberland County, Virginia, in the spring of 1847 was a land of contradictions. Tobacco covered the rolling hills as far as the eye could see, creating a patchwork of green that spoke to the region's prosperity. Meandering through the countryside was the James River, providing both transportation and the lifeblood for the plantations that dotted its banks. This was a place where Gentile society flourished on the backs of enslaved labor, where plantation owners gathered for elaborate dinners while their human property toiled in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Nearly 2,000 acres of prime Virginia soil, about 15 miles southwest of the county seat of Cumberland Courthouse, is where Peton Grove sat. For 3 generations, the plantation had been in the Peton family. Built in the 1760s by Josiah Peton, using wealth accumulated through tobacco cultivation and what locals euphemistically called agricultural investments, the main house was an imposing 3-story structure with white columns and wraparound porches. From its position atop a gentle rise, it commanded a view of the entire property. By 1847, the plantation was under the management of Cornelius Peton, Josiah's grandson, a man known throughout the county for his business acumen and his particular approach to managing enslaved workers. On maintaining direct control over every aspect of plantation life, Cornelius prided himself, unlike some of his neighbors who relied on overseers. A man of medium height, he had penetrating gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that he kept meticulously groomed. His wife Margaret was the daughter of a Richmond banking family, and together they had 4 children: Samuel aged 22, Elizabeth 19, Thomas 16, and young Mary just 12 years old. Also included in the Peton household was Cornelius's elderly mother, Prudence, who at 78 still maintained strict oversight of the domestic arrangements, and Margaret's unmarried sister, Catherine, who had come to live with the family after their father's death the previous year. The extended family was completed by Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Jonathan Pemberton, a physician who had studied in Philadelphia before returning to Virginia to establish his practice. Frequently, Jonathan stayed at the plantation when treating patients in the rural areas of the county. What set the Peton plantation apart from others in the region was not just its size or productivity, but the unusual background of its workforce. 43 enslaved individuals had been inherited by Cornelius, but over the years he had acquired several others under circumstances that raised eyebrows among his peers. Unlike most slaveholders who purchased their labor from established markets in Richmond or Norfolk, Cornelius had a peculiar habit of acquiring individuals whom other owners had deemed problematic or unmanageable. It was through this practice that Isaac came to Peton Grove in the autumn of 1844. The man, who would later be known throughout Virginia by a far more sinister name, had originally belonged to a plantation in neighboring Prince Edward County, where he had worked in the slaughterhouse. His previous owner, a man named Fielding Crawford, had been eager to sell Isaac after what he described in correspondence as incidents of an increasingly disturbing nature. An imposing physical presence was what Isaac was, standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that seemed disproportionately large even for his frame. His most striking feature was his eyes, a pale gray that seemed almost colorless in certain light, giving him an unsettling gaze that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. Little was spoken by him, preferring to communicate through nods and gestures, though those who worked alongside him noted that his silence wasn't born of ignorance, but of careful observation. Particularly valuable to plantation owners was Isaac's exceptional skill with a blade. A hog could be dressed by him in half the time it took most men, his knife work so precise that virtually no meat was wasted in the process. Encyclopedic was his knowledge of anatomy. He knew exactly where to cut to separate joints, how to remove organs without puncturing them, and how to preserve meat for long-term storage. These skills had made him indispensable at his previous plantation, despite the growing unease his presence seemed to generate among both enslaved and free residents. Never fully documented in official records were the incidents that had prompted Crawford to sell Isaac, but whispered accounts spoke of livestock found butchered with unnecessary brutality, their remains arranged in ways that served no practical purpose. Also, there were rumors of Isaac being found standing over freshly slaughtered animals long after his work should have been completed, his clothes spotless despite the nature of his labor, as if he had found ways to perform his duties without getting a single drop of blood on himself. When Cornelius Peton acquired Isaac in 1844, he believed he was getting a bargain, a skilled laborer at a fraction of the usual cost. So eager had Crawford been to complete the sale that he accepted nearly 30% less than Isaac's assessed value, requiring only that Peton promised never to sell Isaac back to any plantation in Prince Edward County. For nearly 3 years, Isaac worked at Peton Grove without incident. The plantation's meat production was his assignment, overseeing the slaughter of livestock and the preservation of meat for both the family's consumption and sale to neighboring properties. By his own preference, he worked alone in a building that had been constructed specifically for this purpose about 200 yards from the main house. A sturdy brick structure with thick walls and few windows was the slaughterhouse, designed to keep the interior cool even during Virginia's oppressive summers. Inside, Isaac had arranged his tools with military precision, knives of every size and shape hanging from wooden pegs, sharpening stones positioned at exact intervals, and a collection of cleavers that he maintained with obsessive care. Always immaculately clean was the building, despite the nature of the work performed there, leading some to wonder how Isaac managed to complete his tasks without leaving the usual signs of his profession. The morning of March 15, 1847 began like any other at Peton Grove. The scent of tobacco seedlings and the promise of another profitable growing season were carried on the early spring air. In the kitchen garden, Margaret Peton was directing the preparation of beds for vegetables that would feed the plantation's inhabitants through the coming months. At their lessons with their tutor were the children, Professor Aldrich, who came from Richmond twice weekly to ensure they received proper education befitting their social station. The morning had been spent by Cornelius in his study, reviewing accounts and correspondence with factors in Richmond regarding the upcoming tobacco auction. Encouraging were the numbers. Premium prices had been commanded by the previous year's crop, and early indicators suggested this year would be even better. More profit in 1847 than in any previous year in its history was what the plantation was positioned to generate, by his calculations. It was Dr. Jonathan Peton who first noticed something amiss. The previous evening, he had arrived at the plantation to treat several enslaved workers who had developed symptoms of what appeared to be influenza. As was his custom, he had planned to examine the patients again before departing for his next calls. However, when he approached the quarters shortly after noon, he found them eerily quiet. The doctor's first instinct was that the patients were resting, recovering from their illness under the care of old Bessie, the plantation's designated healer. But as he drew closer to the small wooden structures that housed the enslaved population, he became aware of an unusual odor, not the typical smells associated with the quarters, but something sharper, more metallic. It was then that he noticed the door to Isaac's cabin standing open, swaying slightly in the afternoon breeze. This was unusual, as Isaac was known for his preference for privacy, and typically kept his door closed even during the warmest weather. More disturbing was what appeared to be dark stains on the wooden threshold. stains that looked disturbingly similar to dried blood. With growing apprehension, Dr. Peton approached the cabin. His medical training had exposed him to blood in many forms, and he recognized the distinctive color and pattern of these stains. They weren't the result of a minor injury or the usual accidents that occurred during manual labor. Something far more serious was suggested by these stains. Pushing the door fully open, the doctor peered into the cabin's dim interior. What he saw defied immediate comprehension. The usually Spartan room had been transformed into something resembling a macabre exhibition. Isaac's few personal possessions had been arranged with geometric precision, but it was what hung from the cabin's rafters that caused Dr. Peton to stumble backward in horror. Suspended from rope that appeared to have been measured and cut with mathematical precision were what initially appeared to be sides of pork or beef. But as the doctor's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window, he realized with growing revulsion that these were not animal remains. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate, and the proportions were unmistakably human. As he backed away from the cabin, Dr. Peton's hands shook, his medical training warring with his instinct to flee. He had seen death in many forms during his practice, but nothing had prepared him for the clinical precision with which these remains had been prepared. Each cut appeared to have been made with surgical accuracy, separating joints at exactly the right points, removing organs with a skill that spoke to extensive anatomical knowledge. What disturbed him most was not just the presence of human remains, but their condition. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence in the usual sense. The cuts were clean, methodical, suggesting that considerable time and care had been taken by whoever had performed this work. It was as if someone had approached the human body with the same professional detachment they might show when butchering livestock. Barely carrying him back toward the main house were the doctor's legs, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. As he stumbled across the plantation grounds, he became aware of other disturbing details he had initially missed. The usual sounds of plantation life were absent. No voices calling from the fields, no children playing around the quarters, no cooking fires sending smoke curling into the afternoon sky. When Dr. Peton reached the main house, he found the front door standing ajar, another detail that struck him as wrong. Meticulous about security was Margaret Peton, and she would never have left the house unsecured during the day. Calling out for his brother, the doctor received no response. The house, like the quarters, was unnaturally quiet. Moving through the ground floor rooms, Dr. Peton found signs of normal daily life abruptly interrupted. In the dining room, the table was set for the midday meal, but the food remained untouched, congealing on china plates that bore the Peton family crest. In the parlor, Margaret's needlework lay abandoned on her favorite chair, the needle still trailing a length of blue silk thread. It was when he reached the foot of the main staircase that Dr. Peton made the discovery that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Dark stains similar to those he had observed at Isaac's cabin traced a path up the carpeted stairs, creating a pattern that suggested something heavy had been dragged from the upper floors. The scene that greeted Dr. Jonathan Peton on the upper floors of the Peton mansion would be burned into his memory forever. In what had once been Cornelius's private study, the doctor found his brother's body arranged in a manner that defied all understanding of human behavior. Cornelius sat in his leather chair behind his mahogany desk, his hands positioned as if he had been writing in his ledger, but his head had been removed with surgical precision and placed on the desktop like some grotesque paperweight. Most profoundly disturbing to Dr. Peton was the clinical nature of the arrangement. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or scattered papers. The room appeared exactly as it would have on any normal day, except for the impossible presence of his brother's severed head, positioned with careful attention to detail. Even more unsettling, Cornelius's body showed no signs of the violent struggle such an act should have required. Moving through the house in a state approaching shock, the doctor discovered that every member of the Peton household had met a similar fate. Margaret was found in the master bedroom, positioned as if she had been arranging flowers in a vase on the dressing table. Her body remained upright, but her head had been removed and placed among the blooms she had been arranging, creating a tableau that was both artistic and horrifying. In the nursery, the children had been discovered, arranged as if they were playing a game. Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and young Mary sat in a circle on the floor, their bodies positioned naturally, but each had been decapitated with the same surgical precision. Their heads had been placed in the center of their circle, facing inward as if they were engaged in conversation. Old Prudence was found in her rocking chair on the back porch, positioned as if she were watching the sunset, her severed head placed on a small table beside her chair next to her Bible and reading spectacles. In the kitchen, Catherine was discovered, apparently in the midst of preparing bread, her head placed on the wooden cutting board where she had been working. Even more disturbing was the complete absence of blood throughout the house. Despite the obvious violence that had occurred, there were no spatters on walls, no pools on floors, no signs of the carnage such acts should have produced. It was as if each person had been killed elsewhere and then carefully positioned in these domestic tableaus. Details that others might have missed were observed by Dr. Peaton's medical training. The cuts on each body were identical in their precision, made by someone with extensive knowledge of human anatomy. Clean were the edges of the wounds, suggesting extremely sharp instruments wielded by steady hands. Most disturbing of all, there were no defensive wounds on any of the victims. No signs that they had attempted to fight off their attacker. Another chilling detail was revealed by the doctor's examination of the bodies. Each victim appeared to have been killed by a single precise cut to the neck made from behind with surgical accuracy. The positioning of the wound suggested that the victims had been unaware of their attacker's approach, killed so quickly that they had no opportunity to react or defend themselves. When Cumberland County Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne arrived at Peton Grove the following morning, summoned by Dr. Peton's frantic midnight ride to the courthouse, he brought with him 2 deputies and a county coroner. What they found challenged every assumption about criminal behavior that their combined experience had provided. A man of considerable experience in dealing with violence on the Virginia frontier was Sheriff Hawthorne. He had investigated murders committed in passion, robberies that had turned deadly, and even the occasional slave uprising that had been violently suppressed. But the scene at Peton Grove was unlike anything in his 20 years of law enforcement. The sheriff's initial focus was on determining how one person could have killed 13 individuals without any of them raising an alarm or attempting to escape. No signs of forced entry were shown by the house, suggesting that the killer had been admitted willingly or had possessed keys to the property. More puzzling was the question of how the bodies had been moved and positioned without leaving the blood trails that such activity should have generated. Dr. Peton's observations about the precision of the wounds were confirmed by Coroner William Fitzgerald's preliminary examination of the bodies. Each victim had been killed by a single cut that had severed the carotid arteries and jugular veins with surgical accuracy. Extremely sharp appeared to be the instrument used, and it had been wielded by someone with extensive knowledge of human anatomy. Most troubling to Fitzgerald was the condition of the bodies. Despite having been deceased for at least 12 hours when he examined them, they showed none of the usual signs of decomposition. The skin remained pink and warm to the touch, as if death had occurred only minutes earlier. Absent was the blood that should have pooled in the lower portions of the bodies, as if it had been completely drained from their systems. Quickly, the investigation focused on the enslaved population of Pemberton Grove, both because of the obvious implications of such violence against slaveholders and because several members of the enslaved community were missing. Along with Isaac, 3 other individuals could not be accounted for: Moses, a field hand in his 30s, Sarah, a house servant who had worked in the Peton kitchen, and Peter, a young man who had assisted Isaac in the slaughterhouse. However, when Sheriff Hawthorne and his deputies searched the slave quarters, they found something that complicated their assumptions about what had occurred. In his cabin, Moses was discovered, apparently having died in his sleep. In the kitchen garden, Sarah was found, her body positioned as if she had been working among the vegetables. In the slaughterhouse, Peter was located, arranged as if he had been cleaning equipment. Like the members of the Peton family, all 3 enslaved individuals had been decapitated with the same surgical precision, their heads carefully positioned near their bodies. The discovery of these additional victims forced the investigators to reconsider their initial theories about the nature of the crime. Intensified was the search for Isaac as he remained the only unaccounted-for resident of Peton Grove. Thoroughly searched was his cabin, revealing the disturbing tableau that Dr. Peton had initially discovered. However, closer examination revealed additional details that painted an even more troubling picture of Isaac's activities. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, investigators found a collection of journals written in a careful, educated hand. The entries, dating back nearly 3 years, detailed Isaac's observations of life at Petton Grove with a clinical detachment that chilled even seasoned lawmen. The daily routines of every resident, both enslaved and free, had been recorded by him, noting their habits, their fears, their relationships, and their vulnerabilities. The key to understanding the methodical horror that had unfolded at Petton Grove would prove to be the journals discovered in Isaac's cabin. Written in precise handwriting that suggested considerable education, the entries revealed a mind that had been planning and preparing for months, possibly years. Despite his limited formal education, Sheriff Hawthorne recognized the significance of these documents. He arranged for Professor Marcus Aldrich, the children's former tutor, who had been mercifully absent during the massacre, to assist in translating and interpreting Isaac's writings. What they discovered challenged every assumption about Isaac's background and capabilities. The earliest entries, dating to October 1844, shortly after Isaac's arrival at the plantation, were relatively benign observations about plantation life. Isaac had recorded the daily schedules of family members, the routines of other enslaved workers, and detailed notes about the physical layout of the property. However, even these early writings showed an analytical mind at work, someone who observed human behavior with the detachment of a natural scientist studying specimens. As Professor Aldrich worked through the journals chronologically, a disturbing progression became apparent. Gradually, Isaac's observations shifted from simple recording to active experimentation. He began testing the reactions of both family members and fellow enslaved individuals to subtle changes in routine, documenting their responses with scientific precision. One entry from December 1844 described how Isaac had deliberately moved small objects in the main house to observe whether family members would notice. He recorded Margaret Petton's reaction when she discovered her favorite vase had been moved 6 inches to the left on the mantelpiece, noting that she had appeared disturbed, but unable to articulate the source of her unease. Another entry from February 1845 detailed Isaac's observations of the family's sleeping patterns. He had apparently spent months learning the sounds of the house at night, mapping which floorboards creaked and which doors made noise when opened. His notes revealed an intimate knowledge of the family's nocturnal habits that could only have been gained through careful surveillance. Also contained in the journals were detailed anatomical drawings that demonstrated Isaac's extensive knowledge of human physiology. These weren't crude sketches, but precise medical illustrations showing bone structure, muscle groups, and organ placement. Formal training that seemed impossible for an enslaved person in antebellum, Virginia, was suggested by the level of detail. Disturbing inconsistencies in Isaac's documented history were revealed by Professor Aldrich's investigation into his background. While Fielding Crawford had claimed that Isaac had been born on his Prince Edward County plantation, records showed no birth certificate or baptismal record for any enslaved individual by that name. More troubling, several elderly enslaved people who had lived their entire lives on Crawford's plantation claimed no memory of Isaac before 1842. Additional mysteries surrounding Isaac's past were revealed by the professor's inquiries in Prince Edward County. Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, a physician who had treated enslaved workers on Crawford's plantation, remembered Isaac well, but for reasons that added new layers to the mystery. According to Hutchinson, Isaac had possessed medical knowledge that exceeded that of many trained physicians, particularly in the areas of anatomy and surgical technique. Hutchinson recalled occasions when Isaac had been called upon to assist with medical emergencies involving both human and animal patients. So exceptional was his skill with a knife that Hutchinson had wondered whether Isaac might have received training from a qualified physician, though such education would have been highly unusual for an enslaved person. Also included in the doctor's memories of Isaac were disturbing details about his behavior during medical procedures. Unlike other assistants who showed appropriate emotional responses to suffering, Isaac had remained completely detached, observing procedures with clinical interest rather than human empathy. Increasingly unsettling had been Isaac's presence to Hutchinson, though he admitted that his assistance had been invaluable in several life-threatening situations. Also revealed by the investigation was that Isaac's departure from Crawford's plantation had been more urgent than initially described. Local records showed that 3 enslaved individuals had died under mysterious circumstances in the months preceding Isaac's sale to Cornelius Peton. While the deaths had been attributed to illness, Dr. Hutchinson's private notes, discovered in his personal papers, suggested that he had harbored suspicions about their true cause. The 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, had been found in their quarters, apparently having died peacefully in their sleep. However, Hutchinson's examination had revealed that each had sustained a small puncture wound behind the left ear, so precise and minimal that it was barely visible. The doctor had noted that such wounds could have been made by a thin, sharp instrument inserted with surgical precision to damage the brain stem and cause instant death. Hutchinson's notes indicated that he had shared his suspicions with Crawford, but the plantation owner had been reluctant to pursue an investigation that might have disrupted his operation or attracted unwanted attention from authorities. Instead, Crawford had quietly arranged to sell Isaac to the first buyer who inquired, accepting a significantly reduced price to expedite the transaction. Expanded to include other plantations in the region did Sheriff Hawthorne's investigation, seeking any information about unusual deaths or disappearances that might be connected to Isaac. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who had moved through Virginia's plantation system like a predator, leaving behind a trail of suspicious deaths and unexplained incidents. Records from Chesterfield County showed that a plantation owner named Benjamin Curthers had briefly owned Isaac in 1843 before selling him to Crawford after what he described as unacceptable behavior. Curthers had been reluctant to provide details, but under pressure from Sheriff Hawthorne, he admitted that several of his most valuable enslaved workers had died during Isaac's brief tenure on his property. The deaths had occurred over a period of just 3 months, each victim found in circumstances that suggested natural death, but which Curthers had found increasingly suspicious. Like the deaths on Crawford's plantation, each individual had been discovered with a small, nearly invisible wound behind the left ear. Caras revealed that he had begun to suspect Isaac after observing his behavior around the bodies of the deceased. While other enslaved individuals had shown appropriate grief and respect for their departed community members, Isaac had displayed clinical interest in the corpses, examining them with the detachment of a medical professional conducting an autopsy. The plantation owner's suspicions had been confirmed when he discovered Isaac in the quarters late one night, standing over the body of a recently deceased woman holding what appeared to be a thin, pointed instrument. When confronted, Isaac had calmly explained that he was studying the effects of death on human tissue, a response that had so disturbed Curthers that he had arranged Isaac's sale within days. A sense of urgency among law enforcement officials was created by the mounting evidence of Isaac's deadly progression through Virginia's plantation system. If Isaac had indeed been responsible for numerous deaths across multiple counties, his disappearance represented a threat that extended far beyond Cumberland County. Sheriff Hawthorne coordinated with his counterparts in neighboring jurisdictions to establish a network of communication and search efforts. A dramatic turn was taken by the investigation when Dr. Peton received an unexpected visitor at his temporary residence in Cumberland Courthouse. Samuel Woodson, a free black man who worked as a blacksmith in nearby Farmville, approached the doctor with information that would fundamentally alter their understanding of Isaac's true identity. Woodson claimed to have known Isaac years earlier, before his appearance on any Virginia plantation. According to Woodson, Isaac had not been born into slavery, but had been a free man living in Philadelphia, where he had worked as an assistant to a prominent anatomist and physician. The circumstances that had led to his enslavement were, according to Woodson, far more sinister than anyone had imagined. A man whose intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an obsession with death and human anatomy was the picture painted by the blacksmith's account. Isaac, whose original name had been Isaac Thornton, had reportedly assisted Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a Philadelphia physician who specialized in surgical procedures and anatomical research. However, Woodson claimed that Isaac's interest in his work had gradually evolved from professional curiosity to something far darker. According to Woodson's account, Isaac had been discovered by Dr. Whitfield conducting unauthorized experiments on corpses in the medical college's anatomy laboratory. These experiments had gone far beyond the legitimate study of human anatomy, involving what Woodson described as unnatural manipulations of deceased bodies for no apparent medical purpose. When confronted by Dr. Whitfield, Isaac had apparently shown no remorse or recognition that his behavior was inappropriate. Instead, he had calmly explained that he was exploring the artistic possibilities of human anatomy, treating the human body as if it were raw material for sculptural work rather than the remains of deceased individuals. Dr. Whitfield had immediately terminated Isaac's employment and banned him from the medical college. However, within weeks of his dismissal, several corpses had been discovered missing from the college's anatomy laboratory. More disturbing, the bodies of 3 recently deceased Philadelphia residents had been found in abandoned buildings, arranged in poses that suggested they had been used for some form of macabre artistic expression. The Philadelphia authorities had sought Isaac for questioning in connection with these incidents, but he had vanished from the city before they could locate him. Woodson believed that Isaac had been captured by slave catchers while attempting to flee south, possibly mistaken for a runaway slave due to his mixed racial heritage and lack of free papers. This account, if true, explained many of the mysteries surrounding Isaac's background and capabilities. His extensive knowledge of anatomy, his surgical skills, and his disturbing behavior all aligned with Woodson's description of a man who had received formal medical training, but whose interests had evolved in dangerous directions. Both compelling and terrifying did Dr. Peton find Woodson's account. If Isaac was indeed a formerly trained anatomist who had been forced into slavery, his years of bondage might have transformed his scholarly interest in death into something far more personal and vengeful. Not just homicidal intent, but a carefully planned act of retribution was suggested by the systematic nature of the Peyton Grove massacre. Additional urgency was received by the investigation when reports began reaching Cumberland County of suspicious incidents on plantations throughout central Virginia. The discovery of livestock that had been slaughtered and arranged in disturbing patterns that served no practical purpose was reported by an estate in Buckingham County. Several enslaved workers dead in their quarters were found by another plantation in Charlotte County, each bearing the now familiar small puncture wound behind the left ear. Most alarming was a report from Nottoway County describing the disappearance of an entire family of plantation owners, leaving behind a house that showed no signs of violence, but where investigators found evidence suggesting the family had been systematically stalked for weeks before their disappearance. Search parties were organized by Sheriff Hawthorne that scoured the countryside for any sign of Isaac, focusing on areas that would provide shelter and access to the tools he would need to continue his deadly work. Abandoned buildings, unused barns, and remote caves were all searched, but no trace of the fugitive was discovered. Complicated was the search by the fact that descriptions of Isaac varied significantly among those who had encountered him. Some described him as tall and imposing, others as average in height and unremarkable in appearance. A level of sophistication that made him particularly dangerous was suggested by his ability to blend into different environments and adopt different personas. As weeks passed without any solid leads, the investigation began to focus on Isaac's possible motivations and ultimate objectives. Increasingly disturbing insights into Isaac's psychological state during his time at Peyton Grove were revealed by Professor Aldrich's continued analysis of the journals. The later entries in the journals showed a progression from clinical observation to active planning for what Isaac had begun to refer to as his final experiment. These entries describe detailed plans for the systematic elimination of everyone on the plantation, not as an act of revenge, but as what he termed an exploration of the aesthetic possibilities of mass mortality. Apparently, Isaac had viewed the Peyton Grove massacre as an artistic statement, arranging the bodies of his victims to create tableaus that he believed demonstrated the beauty inherent in death. Sketches showing how he had planned to position each victim were contained in his journals, treating the human bodies as components in a larger composition. Also revealed by the journals was that Isaac had not acted alone in planning the massacre. References to the disciples and fellow students of the art suggested that he had been in communication with others who shared his disturbed interests. These references were cryptic and indirect, but they raised the possibility that Isaac was part of a larger network of individuals with similar proclivities. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cumberland County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of calculated terror. From an unexpected source came the breakthrough in the Isaac investigation. Father O'Sullivan, the Irish priest who served the Catholic families scattered throughout Cumberland and surrounding counties, approached Sheriff Hawthorne with information that would finally explain both Isaac's whereabouts and the true scope of his activities. Father O'Sullivan had been conducting his monthly circuit of remote farmsteads when he encountered a group of travelers on the road between Cumberland Courthouse and Farmville. The group, consisting of 3 men and 1 woman, had been dressed as itinerant preachers, but had behaved in ways that aroused the priest's suspicions. Most disturbing was their leader, a tall man with pale eyes who had insisted on discussing theological questions related to death and resurrection. According to Father O'Sullivan, the conversation had focused obsessively on the physical aspects of death and the condition of the human body after the soul's departure. The man had demonstrated knowledge of anatomy that exceeded anything the priest had encountered outside of medical schools, but his interest had seemed more artistic than scientific. What had truly alarmed Father O'Sullivan was the man's description of recent religious experiences he claimed to have had. He spoke of receiving divine inspiration to help others transcend the limitations of mortal flesh and described visions in which he had been instructed to create living sculptures using human bodies. The man had claimed that through his work he was helping souls achieve a more perfect union with their Creator. Witness accounts of Isaac were matched by the priest's description of the group's leader. But more importantly, Father O'Sullivan had observed the group traveling toward Powhatan County where they claimed to be planning a great revival meeting that would demonstrate their unique approach to spiritual enlightenment. Immediately, Sheriff Hawthorne dispatched riders to alert his counterpart in Powhatan County and began organizing a pursuit party. However, before they could depart Cumberland County, they received word that their destination had already been determined. An urgent message was sent by a plantation owner named Colonel William Randolph, requesting immediate assistance with what he described as the most horrific crime ever perpetrated in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The scene that greeted law enforcement officials at the Randolph plantation exceeded even the horrors discovered at Petton Grove. The colonial-era mansion, which had been in the Randolph family since the 1600s, had been transformed into what could only be described as a gallery of human death. In the main parlor, 17 members of the household had been arranged in an elaborate tableau that depicted what appeared to be a formal dinner party. Each victim had been positioned with meticulous attention to detail, seated around the massive mahogany dining table with their severed heads placed on china plates before them. The arrangement had been designed to create the illusion that the family was sharing a meal together, even in death. Candles had been lit around the room, casting flickering shadows that gave the macabre scene an almost festive atmosphere. But it was in the mansion's ballroom that investigators discovered the true extent of Isaac's artistic vision. The bodies of 32 enslaved individuals from the plantation had been arranged in dancing poses, their heads replaced with the heads of various family members to create the impression of an integrated social gathering that would have been impossible in life. Hours, possibly days of methodical work was spoken to by the precision required to create such a scene. Evidence that Isaac had been assisted by at least 3 other individuals was found by Dr. Petton, who had accompanied the law enforcement team to provide medical expertise. The sheer scope of the work, combined with witness accounts of the traveling preacher group, confirmed that Isaac had successfully recruited disciples who shared his disturbed vision. Additional evidence of Isaac's evolving methodology was revealed by the investigation of the Randolph plantation. Unlike the instantaneous deaths at Petton Grove, several of the Randolph victims showed signs of having been kept alive during the initial stages of their ordeal. The implication was that Isaac and his followers had refined their techniques to extract maximum psychological impact from their victims' final moments. What appeared to be Isaac's field laboratory was discovered by investigators hidden in the plantation's root cellar. The underground chamber had been converted into a surgical suite complete with medical instruments, anatomical charts, and detailed notes describing various experimental procedures. Most disturbing were the detailed sketches showing planned arrangements for future victims, suggesting that the Randolph plantation had been just one stop in a larger campaign of terror. Evidence that Isaac had been conducting what he termed anatomical studies on living subjects before killing them was contained in the laboratory. Restraining devices had been constructed with carpenter's precision, designed to hold victims immobile while Isaac performed procedures that had no medical purpose beyond satisfying his curiosity about human pain responses and the mechanics of death. That Isaac had been documenting the effects of various injuries on his victim's ability to remain conscious and articulate was revealed by Dr. Peton's examination of the laboratory notes. These experiments appeared to be designed to determine the optimal methods for prolonging awareness during the dying process, allowing Isaac to observe and record the psychological impact of approaching death. Its most crucial turn was taken by the investigation when Sheriff Hawthorne discovered evidence that Isaac and his disciples had not yet completed their work at the Randolph plantation. Fresh supplies had been delivered to the laboratory within the previous 48 hours, including surgical instruments that showed no signs of use. More ominously, detailed maps of neighboring plantations had been found with specific locations marked and annotated. The maps revealed that Isaac had conducted extensive surveillance of at least 6 additional properties in Powhatan and Cumberland counties. Each location had been studied with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his earlier attacks. Guard schedules, family routines, and structural layouts had all been documented with military precision. Most alarming was the discovery of a detailed timeline showing planned attacks extending through the summer months of 1847. Apparently, Isaac had envisioned a campaign of terror that would ultimately encompass dozens of plantations throughout central Virginia. His notes suggested that he viewed each attack as part of a larger artistic work, with individual massacres serving as chapters in what he called his treatise on the aesthetics of mortality. The Carrington Plantation in Cumberland County, a property located less than 10 miles from where Sheriff Hawthorne was conducting his investigation, was indicated by the timeline as Isaac's next target. According to Isaac's notes, the attack was scheduled for the following evening, timed to coincide with a planned dinner party that would place the maximum number of victims in a single location. Immediately, Sheriff Hawthorne dispatched riders to warn the Carrington family while organizing the largest manhunt in Virginia's history. Every available law enforcement officer from 5 counties converged on the area between the Randolph and Carrington plantations, determined to intercept Isaac before he could claim additional victims. Complicated was the manhunt by Isaac's apparent ability to move through the countryside without detection. His knowledge of anatomy extended to understanding how tracking dogs located fugitives, and evidence suggested that he had been using various substances to mask his scent and confuse pursuing animals. Numerous false trails and dead ends were found by the search parties, indicating that Isaac was actively working to evade capture. As evening approached on what Isaac's timeline indicated would be the night of the Carrington attack, law enforcement officials had still found no trace of the fugitive or his disciples. The decision was made to use the Carrington plantation as bait, positioning armed officers throughout the property while allowing the planned dinner party to proceed under heavy but concealed security. Colonel James Carrington, a veteran of the War of 1812 and an experienced military commander, insisted on maintaining normal household routines to avoid alerting Isaac that his plans had been discovered. The dinner party proceeded as scheduled with 12 guests and family members dining in the main house while nearly 30 armed men waited in concealment around the property. Not from the direction anyone had anticipated did the attack come. Rather than approaching the main house directly, Isaac and his disciples had apparently spent days tunneling beneath the plantation grounds, using their knowledge of the property's layout to create an underground network that allowed them to emerge inside the house itself. The first indication that something was wrong came when one of the dinner guests, Mrs. Elizabeth Carrington, commented that she could hear what sounded like scratching beneath the dining room floor. Before anyone could respond to her observation, sections of the wooden flooring began to give way, and 4 figures emerged from beneath the house with the sudden violence of predators springing from ambush. Dramatically had Isaac's appearance changed since his disappearance from Peton Grove. His hair had grown long and unkempt, and his clothes were stained with substances that the dinner guests preferred not to identify. Most disturbing was his expression. The clinical detachment that witnesses had described had been replaced by something approaching religious ecstasy, as if he viewed his deadly work as a form of worship. Equally transformed were the 3 disciples who accompanied Isaac. 2 appeared to be former enslaved individuals who had somehow joined Isaac's cause, while the third was recognizably white, possibly an overseer or small farmer who had been recruited into Isaac's twisted philosophy. All 4 moved with practiced coordination, suggesting extensive planning and rehearsal. Unlike anything in the previous massacres was the attack that followed. Rather than the swift surgical killings that had characterized Isaac's earlier work, the assault on the Carrington dinner party became a prolonged ordeal designed to maximize psychological impact. Apparently, Isaac and his disciples had decided to abandon stealth in favor of conducting their work in full view of living witnesses. Caught off guard by the attackers' method of entry, the hidden law enforcement officers found themselves unable to intervene without risking the lives of the dinner guests. A confined space had become the dining room where any gunfire might prove as dangerous to victims as to perpetrators. The full extent of his psychological deterioration was revealed by Isaac's behavior during the attack. He moved through the room like a conductor directing an orchestra, positioning his disciples and issuing instructions with calm authority while chaos erupted around him. On creating another of his disturbing tableaus seemed to be his primary focus, treating the terror of living victims as simply another component in his artistic vision. For nearly 2 hours lasted the standoff in the Carrington dining room, during which time Isaac demonstrated the full extent of his psychological manipulation skills. Rather than immediately killing his captives, he engaged them in what he described as philosophical discussions about the nature of death and the human soul's relationship to physical existence. The twisted logic that had driven his campaign of terror was revealed by Isaac's monologue, witnessed by law enforcement officers positioned outside the dining room windows. He spoke of death as the ultimate artistic medium, claiming that the arrangement of lifeless human bodies allowed him to create beauty that transcended the limitations of conventional art. In his mind, he was not committing murder, but rather crafting sculptures using the finest materials available. Unwilling participants in Isaac's deranged philosophy lesson found themselves the captive dinner guests, paralyzed by fear and the immediate threat of violence. He forced them to examine the bodies of 2 victims he had already killed, pointing out what he considered the aesthetic qualities of their final poses and explaining his techniques for preserving the appearance of life even after death. Observing from his concealed position outside the house, Dr. Peton recognized that Isaac's behavior had evolved far beyond simple homicidal intent. An elaborate intellectual framework had been developed by the man that allowed him to view his crimes as contributions to human knowledge and artistic expression. Nodding approvingly at his explanations were his disciples, suggesting that they had fully embraced his twisted worldview. The breakthrough came when Colonel Carrington, drawing on his military experience, managed to signal the concealed officers using a prearranged code involving the position of his hands on the dining table. The signal indicated that Isaac and his disciples had positioned themselves in a formation that would allow coordinated gunfire to neutralize all 4 attackers without endangering the remaining hostages. Swift and decisive was the assault. Windows exploded inward as law enforcement officers simultaneously breached the dining room from 3 directions. Isaac, caught in the middle of explaining his anatomical techniques to a terrified Mrs. Carrington, had no opportunity to react before multiple rifle balls struck him center mass. His 3 disciples attempted to use their hostages as human shields, but the officers' positioning had been planned to prevent such tactics. Within seconds, all 4 attackers lay dead on the Carrington dining room floor, their blood mingling with that of their earlier victims in a final, unintended tableau. The immediate threat was ended by Isaac's death, but the investigation into his activities would continue for months. Evidence linking him to suspicious deaths across 6 counties spanning nearly 4 years was revealed by the subsequent examination of his laboratory and journals. Conservative estimates suggested that Isaac and his disciples had been responsible for the deaths of over 100 individuals, making them among the most prolific killers in American history. That Isaac's network of disciples had extended beyond the 3 men killed at the Carrington plantation was revealed by the discovery of correspondence in his laboratory. Letters from individuals in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia suggested that Isaac had been recruiting followers across the entire southeastern United States, spreading his philosophy of death as art to receptive minds in the slaveholding regions. Throughout the South, law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts to track down these additional disciples, leading to arrests and investigations that continued well into 1848. Several individuals were identified as having participated in suspicious deaths that bore Isaac's distinctive characteristics, though many others successfully evaded capture by fleeing to the Western Territories. Far beyond his direct victims extended the psychological impact of Isaac's campaign. Unprecedented security measures were implemented by plantation owners throughout Virginia, fundamentally altering the relationship between enslaved and free populations. A climate of suspicion that poisoned social relationships across the region was created by the realization that someone with Isaac's intelligence and skills could operate undetected for years. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Isaac's philosophy had found adherents among both enslaved and free populations. His journals contained letters from supporters who praised his work and expressed interest in learning his techniques. The idea that systematic killing could be justified as artistic expression had apparently resonated with individuals whose resentments and grievances had led them to embrace violence as a form of creative expression. Concluded did the official investigation with a report that was immediately classified and sealed by Virginia authorities. The document, not discovered until after the Civil War, revealed that Isaac's true identity remained a mystery despite extensive investigation. Samuel Woodson's account of Isaac's Philadelphia background could never be verified, and no records of an Isaac Thornton matching his description could be found in Pennsylvania. The report speculated that Isaac might have been an educated free black man who had deliberately entered the slave system to gain access to potential victims, or possibly a white man whose mixed racial heritage had allowed him to pass as enslaved when convenient. Formal education that exceeded anything typically available to enslaved individuals was suggested by his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to manipulate both individual victims and entire communities. More troubling was the report's conclusion that Isaac's campaign represented not an isolated incident, but possibly the beginning of a larger movement. References in his correspondence suggested that similar individuals were operating in other slaveholding regions, using the cover of the plantation system to pursue their deadly interests. The investigators recommended ongoing surveillance and coordination between law enforcement agencies to identify and neutralize additional threats. For decades would influence Virginia society the legacy of Isaac's crimes. The systematic nature of his attacks and his ability to operate undetected for years highlighted vulnerabilities in the plantation system that had previously been ignored. Forced to reconsider their assumptions about the people they held in bondage were slaveholders by the realization that enslaved individuals could possess sophisticated knowledge and planning capabilities. Also revealed by the case were the dangers inherent in a social system that allowed individuals to move between properties with minimal documentation or verification. Isaac's ability to assume new identities and gain access to multiple plantations had been facilitated by the informal networks through which enslaved people were bought and sold, creating opportunities for predators to exploit the system's weaknesses. In the end, not in the supernatural or unexplainable lay the true horror of Isaac's story, but in the calculated application of human intelligence to the pursuit of evil. His crimes demonstrated that the capacity for systematic violence existed within the normal parameters of human behavior, requiring only the right combination of opportunity, skill, and twisted motivation to manifest in devastating ways. How easily evil can hide behind the facade of normalcy and how systems of oppression can provide cover for the most heinous crimes is shown by this mystery. That the greatest monsters are often those who appear most rational and controlled is reminded to us by the meticulous planning and execution of Isaac's campaign. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Isaac's true identity and motives? Leave your comment below and let me know which historical mysteries from your area you'd like us to investigate next. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Often the ones that were deliberately hidden are the darkest chapters of American history. And together, we'll continue uncovering the secrets that powerful people tried to bury forever. See you in the next video.